Who knows whom? I've been studying Buddhist Yogacarya philosophy and teachings this year, and I've kind of been on a many-month or year mission to better understand death, dying, and rebirth. Obviously, because I'm getting old, it might be worthwhile getting a better understanding. So the main focus has been what is called the Storehouse-Consciousness, or in Sanskrit it's Alayavijnana. It's the repository of our personal karma, our karmic traces, seed impulses, and whatnot. It's in the Storehouse consciousness that our every intent and karmic trace is stored. It's where it ripens and eventually arises or remains available as karma that we must work out. And it's also used to direct or to assist in our creating our next persona, our next self in our rebirth. Now the Alayavijnana will accompany us through all of our lifetimes, and it has up to now, until the point when we are finally enlightened, at which time it will be empty, and so it's written, cease to concern us. Until then, however, it's as close to us as ourself. In fact, it's the very mother of the self, in that we subliminally draw upon it constantly. At this point, I feel I have at least a rough grasp of the situation concerning rebirth and what part of us makes it through the bardo after our death to be born again. Although I'm sure I'm missing some of the fine points. I'm just trying to grasp this concept. So I'd like to go over this briefly with those of you interested, if that's okay. It may be a little unfinished, but hey, that's the way it is right now with me. I'm not a scholar by nature, but I examine these things because I literally just want to know. So please feel free to share with me your thoughts on this topic, if you will. I'm not concerning myself here with the steps or levels in the bardo. There are whole books about that, and they can be as complicated as you want. But I'm concerned here primarily with what dies, what transmigrates, and what is reborn. And of course, knowing me, I'd like to start with an analogy. The human body exists through time because of the endless replacement of its cells. It's a process of constant renewal. Our body looks the same, aside from growth and natural aging, but it actually changes constantly by the replenishment of the cells throughout. So the cells endlessly change, but it's the same body. What does that tell us? In a similar way, the Alayavijnana, the Storehouse Consciousness, moves through time from innumerable lives ago in our past to now, and it will move on to who knows how many future lives. I joke to myself, it's like a floating barge, hopefully not a garbage scow, but it's something like that. And it follows us up the river of time, constantly being refreshed with our actions, good, bad, or indifferent. Like an eternal stew of our desires and our karma, it's forever at a low boil, a convection-driven torus that we are constantly adding to and subtracting from. of course, all of this is below our threshold of awareness. The very scholarly discussions on the storehouse consciousness tell us that the alaya changes, the Alayavijnana. And here's the interesting part. But the Alayavijnana, the storehouse consciousness, changes at a slower rate of change than we're used to in this life we're living now. And because of this slower rate of change, or perhaps due to that fact, subliminally, the Alayavijnana is our constant companion. And over time it appears to be the one constant in our constantly changing, ever-changing consciousness. And because it appears constant to us, it's taught that we identify with the Alayavijnana as permanent because it's slower moving than we are. And because it appears constant, it's taught that we identify with the Alayavijnana as permanent, as the very heart depth of ourself. You know, that's where everything that we use to make up ourself basically comes from, or a lot of it, or the basis of it. And the Buddhist scholars make it clear that taking this substratum, this Alayavijnana, as permanent, by thinking it's permanent, whether we think of it as a soul or a center of attention, center of fixation, or whatever, that is a mistake, since it's not permanent. But it, like everything else, is also in perpetual change, but just at a slower rate than what we're used to. To give an analogy, the Alayavijnana is like a river. It's ever flowing onward toward the future, carrying us into the future, but it's always the same river. If we take a photo of it, like a snapshot, and compare it to another snapshot taken later, of course it looks like the same river. However, if we take a movie of the river, we instantly can see the flow and the constant change, because it's changing completely every second. Now, perhaps the self is like this. It's always there as our touchstone, but it's in perpetual change also. And it changes at a rate that is slow enough that it's like two trains passing one another. It appears that one of them is standing still from the faster moving train. And so the experts say we take that standing stillness of the Alayavijnana, our subconscious, as a sign of something being permanency, something that we can count on, and we do. And the proof of this is that, of course, we act like we're going to live forever. This whole topic has been, for me, a trip. Such as finding that the Buddhists don't agree with the Hindus, or with the Christians, and so on. Those who believe that we are an eternal soul journeying through time, exchanging one body for another, but always keeping the same eternal soul. The Tibetan Buddhists say that there's no such thing as a permanent soul, and that the self we think we are is in fact fluid. It's part of a process, and like everything else, it's not something permanent we simply can count on. In fact, there's nothing we can count on. And yet, despite our condition, and this is what's remarkable, here we are. You know, our very existence, what we are is at least something. I trust the Tibetan Buddhists, and particularly my teacher, to know the truth, because in every area where I am able to check them out, check out all the Rinpoches and the teachings, Where I can check it, the Dharma teachings come through clear as a bell. Thus, in this area of death, transmigration, and rebirth, will have no quick way of checking the truth of what they say. I take their word for it. I mean, the day will come for me, for each of us, when we will find out for sure what the case is. That's if I can stay awake or aware enough until then. I have such confidence that I was willing to take a deep breath, perhaps squelch a gulp or two, and live with the idea that everything I know of as me will be left at death's doorstep in a heap, as who knows whom moves on and takes rebirth, drawing around itself like a mask another persona and a new self. If death is a bitter pill, I was ready to take it. However, if it's something more, that's better. And I'm so relatively ignorant in all this compared to the Tibetan masters. I'm just trying to put the pieces together like a jigsaw puzzle until some kind of image stands out that I can see and understand. I have been willing to trust myself, and this on faith, to the inevitable. And it's not like there's a choice. Yet I worry about what happens between the end of me, myself, and I in this life, and some different me that my karma and desires will create at a future rebirth. And I'm reminded of what Shakespeare wrote in Hamlet's soliloquy. And I quote, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. End quote. So anyway, regardless of what I think or what you think, this whole life we are living is miraculous and amazing. However the truth finally turns out to be, this whole thing is working somehow, and it has worked since eternity. So if we ever do realize the whole enchilada, so to speak, I know it will be perfect, just as it is. And I can say that the more I learn, the more comfortable I am with it all. In other words, it might not be as stark and void as I first thought. And I'm comforted by the thought that whatever the case, we each have been doing this before, and doing it endlessly at that. And here we are right now, all of us present, just lacking enough realization to go into that good night with confidence. As Dylan Thomas said, quote, rage, rage against the dying of the light. Perhaps I don't have to fight so hard, don't have to rage or fear so much anymore. And another point, as I study more deeply this whole concept of the self, the Alayavijnana, not to mention language, with all of the conceptual and mental processes it has, I begin to see that we are almost hopelessly trapped in samsara, which is just what the Buddhists point out. The picture the Lamas paint is one of endless recursion, with the subliminal, the Alayavijnana, and language, etc., which is part of it, much more than just the passive vehicle I first took it for. Instead, language seems much more incestuous than that, with everything not just being stored, but also everything feeding on itself, reinforcing itself, in an endlessly self-modifying renewal. In other words, the self tries to maintain itself at all costs. I believe that in Western esotericism this is called the monad. And perhaps it's like an endless pot of soup, always on low boil, to which new ingredients are always being added, and the results are always being withdrawn as sustenance or for use. However you want to spell it, the idea I now have is of a much more ingrown vehicle, wrapped and endlessly wrapping itself in its own process as it sails through time like a great ship. It's like the old phrase, quote, "the only constant is change itself," end quote. I think the Buddhists make that point clear enough. Yet another point, which I've mentioned in earlier blogs, is the tendency of language, thinking, conceptualization, and mentation in general to virtualize itself, to become increasingly more conceptual, ever moving away from the reality of the senses, feeling, and toward more complex conceptualization. It's like a set of those nested Russian Matryoshka dolls, stair-stepping away from reality into the virtual. Let's face it, if you examine all of this that I am speaking of carefully, the self reminds me of an Egyptian mummy, but one that endlessly wraps itself up tighter. I mean, in that sense, we are as virtual as can be. It's no wonder that deep down we want to be free of what Shakespeare calls the pale cast of thought. And it's much more complex than I had imagined. And while I am fascinated by it all, at the same time, I only need to grasp enough so that I can get a handle on it and roughly realize the teachings. I'm not a scholar, and I have no interest in following all of this out in every detail until the last dog dies. Give me just enough realization to set my sails properly, and I am off to wherever I'm going after death. I'm not a pedant. Unfortunately, where I'm going is very much dependent on how I get there. So it all circles right back around on itself to now and to where I am right here. I have read just about all that I can read, and I am practicing as best as I know how. There comes a time when we put the books aside and we just take hold of the steering wheel again and let the rubber find the road.